Bonjour, Ani, welcome. And Miigwech, thank you all for joining us this evening for the Dean's Distinguished Lecture, which is presented by the UBC Faculty of Education and the Janusz Korczak Association of Canada. For today's event, we are using Zoom's live captioning to ensure this event is more accessible and inclusive. It may automatically be showing on your screen. Please look to the bottom of your Zoom window for the live transcript button, where you have the option to turn it on and off according to your preference. If you need assistance or if anyone is experiencing any audio or visual or video issues, please reach out via the chat feature in Zoom. My name is Jan Hare, and I'm pleased to serve as Dean Pro Tem of the UBC Faculty of Education. As an Anishinaabe from the Chaging First Nation in Northern Ontario, I'm a guest on these Indigenous lands that our university has come to occupy. Before we begin our program, I would like to acknowledge that UBC Vancouver is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. And our UBC Okanagan campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. These lands have always been places of seamless living, learning, and livelihoods for Indigenous peoples who, for millennia, have passed on their cultures, histories, languages, and traditions from one generation to the next in these places. I would also like to recognize that you are joining us today from many places near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. As you take pause to think about the lands in which you reside, I want to acknowledge our friends, families, colleagues, and neighbors in Merritt who are experiencing the impacts of heavy rain and flooding, facing yet another evacuation, and to those who are finding shelter from the mudslides in community emergency shelters. So we wish for patience and strength and wish them safety. This evening, we focus on reconciling history. With this emphasis, I would also like to take a moment to remember the countless Indigenous children who lie in unmarked graves across the country. We stand in solidarity with Indigenous communities and residential school survivors as we grieve for the missing children and the families and communities they did not return to. This means for us as a Faculty of Education, we need to reflect on the seriousness of what has happened in the name of education. This history reveals the deeply rooted ideologies of white settler supremacy and colonial logics that shape our education institutes, both past and present. As an Indigenous scholar and educator, I believe that for us to heal our spirits, to be accountable to Indigenous learners and communities, and to reconcile our past, we as an institution must recognize these truths and honor these relationships. As we get underway, I would like to bring your attention to UBC's Respectful Environment Statement. We ask that everyone participating in today's virtual event recognize that we are coming here from different backgrounds and different lived experiences. Please help contribute to creating a respectful and inclusive environment for our speakers, our volunteers, and our UBC alumni and community members. We are so fortunate this evening to be joined by the Honorable Janet Austin, Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia, who has graciously agreed to deliver a greeting to our attendees of this distinguished lecture. Your Honor, we welcome you this evening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hare, and thank you for inviting me to join you today. It's a very meaningful occasion for me personally. I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt, whom I thank for the privilege of living and working on these lands. As Lieutenant Governor, I felt it was important that I make an effort to learn a little bit of an Indigenous language as a mark of respect. And the language that has been selected for me by elders is Sinchasan, the traditional language of the Huasanish people, just a little bit north of me here in the Greater Victoria area. So I will say, with apologies for my pronunciation, Aitsquaichel, Stelacha, Iquanis, Konangahela, Ananuhilak, Nushquelaquins, Adisjay, which is, good day, dear friends. It's wonderful to be among you today. And I do mean that so sincerely. And I feel very proud of the work that is done all together by the group assembled to speak with us this evening. It's wonderful also to be among so many friends with whom I've had the privilege of working over the years. When I think of the collaboration between the Korczak Association and the UBC Faculty of Education, I feel such strong alignment with the values that I personally ascribe to and the goals that I have set for myself as Lieutenant Governor. When I assumed my post, I pledged to use my time as Lieutenant Governor to continue to bring profile to issues of social justice that I have long been associated with. And of course, advancing reconciliation and addressing the needs and rights of children are top of my list. As a representative of the Crown, an historic colonial institution, I feel this responsibility deeply, and I believe there is a special onus on me to be a visible and vocal champion. I'm grateful for this opportunity to hear from the legendary Dr. Sydney Blackstock, the 2017 Korczak Medal recipient. Her fearless advocacy has inspired a transformation in our understanding, certainly in my understanding, of the legacy of colonialism and the consequent inequalities that are so deeply and stubbornly entrenched in Canadian society. In recent months, the devastating discovery of unmarked graves of children at several former residential schools has forced Canadians to confront the atrocities of our past. Each of those children represents the loss of a precious being and the loss of culture, language, and potential. It is my profound hope that we are finally ready to learn from this history and to ensure that their stories are not lost. I believe we must resolve to do better, to be better, to move forward in the true spirit of truth and reconciliation, and in the spirit of Dr. Korczak, no matter how difficult the truths of the past and the present may be. I'm proud to say how much my values and my views have been shaped by several others of you here today. The 29 Korczak recipient, Dr. Chris Locke, whose longtime leadership on FASD and early development issues has been central to the YWCA's work in the downtown East Side for close to 30 years. And I had the privilege of working with her during my time as CEO of that organization. Dr. Locke inspired me to advocate for a priority focus on social pediatrics during my tenure on the board of the Canadian Pediatric Society, work that I feel very proud of. Dr. Jennifer Charlesworth, who delivered last year's lecture and whose lifelong commitment to child welfare is legendary here in British Columbia. And I'm proud to have collaborated with Jennifer as well in the past and to support her in her current work as well. I'm grateful to have found common cause with Dr. Bly Frank and to have had the privilege of supporting his leadership and work as well. And I offer my heartfelt congratulations to him and to the Korczak Scholarship recipient, Ms. Azra Afreen, on the recognition that you both received today. And I thank Jerry Nussbaum and Lillian Borax-Nemetz for their leadership of the Korczak Association. I've been deeply touched by the humanitarian leadership of Dr. Korczak, this extraordinary man who reimagined the relationship between children and adults as fully equal, and whose vision was so far ahead of his time that we are only now beginning to catch up with him. Dr. Korczak trusted children enough to respect their ability to shape their own decisions and laws, and to develop the skills to govern themselves wisely. These are skills that are required now more than ever before, as today's children face a level of accelerating change, complexity, and pressure that is unique in history. Janusz Korczak was a man of great personal courage, a gentle humanitarian, a man of love, and a revolutionary thinker. The revolution he sought was in the fundamental relationship between children and adults. His revolution was based in understanding and respect for the potential of every newborn baby and every young child, and the necessity for a community of supportive adults to respect and nurture that potential. Korczak understood that whoever saves just one child saves a whole world. And so I thank you all for the part you play in realizing his vision. Thank you again, Heichka, and I look very much forward to the unfolding of the events this evening. Heichka Siem.
Well, miigwech in my Anishinaabe language, miigwech. Thank you, Your Honor. One, for learning the language and bringing the language to us from that territory, as well as for your inspiring words. Her Honor, of course, has devoted much of her career to public service and volunteerism, including leadership roles in the YWCA and the Big Sisters of the BC Lower Mainland. The themes that Her Honor designated for her mandate are diversity and inclusion, democracy, and civic engagement, as well as reconciliation. All three of these themes will recur this evening as we hear from our various speakers. Unable to join us tonight as earlier planned is the Honorable Stephen Lewis Point, Chancellor of the University of British Columbia. Chancellor Point was to also provide us with welcoming remarks, but we've learned that he is among those caught in the mudslides on the highway near Agassiz. So we understand that he is safe, but unable to join us this evening. As I mentioned earlier, the Dean's Distinguished Lecture is presented in collaboration with Janusz Korczak, Association of Canada. A little later this evening, Lillian Borax-Nemetz, who was born in Warsaw and who survived the Holocaust, will explain more to us about Dr. Korczak's life and legacy. The goal of the Dean's Distinguished Lecture is to build awareness about Dr. Korczak's vision for children's rights, education, and well-being. What tonight's Dean's Distinguished Lecture has in common with Dr. Korczak is a profound and lifelong commitment to the care of and responsibility towards children. And the Faculty of Education is grateful to Dr. Cindy Blackstock for agreeing to join us this evening to give this lecture. Dr. Blackstock has spent her career advocating for Indigenous children's rights and is a highly influential voice within the Indigenous social work and child rights communities. The Globe and Mail describes her as Canada's relentless moral voice for First Nations equality. Cindy Blackstock is a member of the Gitxsan Nation, Gitxsan meaning people of the River of Mist, and comprises the lands around the basin and the headwaters of the Skeena River in British Columbia. Cindy was born in Burns Lake, British Columbia, and grew up off reserve. When she was a child, she wanted an easy bake oven. And I have to say, so did I. But instead, she got a book of poetry, a gift from her aunt. In that book was Patrick Overton's poem, Faith. It's a poem that has guided Dr. Blackstock decades ago when she first understood that someone needed to address the inequities faced by Indigenous children and families in Canada. Driven by this purpose, Cindy has completed a Bachelor of Arts degree, 2 master's degrees, and a PhD in social work, a field she has worked in for more than 25 years. She has been the recipient of more than 18 honorary doctorates in recognition of her longstanding commitment to child protection and Indigenous children's rights. She is a renowned expert in the rights of Indigenous children, assisting the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child to draft and adopt comment on the rights of Indigenous children. Recently, she also worked with Indigenous young people, UNICEF, and the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to produce a youth-friendly version of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Child. Her promotion of culturally based and evidence-informed solutions has been recognized by the Noble Women's Initiative, the Aboriginal Achievement Foundation, Frontline Defenders, and many others. Today, she is best known as the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada, on whose behalf Dr. Blackstock filed a complaint pursuant to the Canadian Human Rights Act, alleging Canada discriminates against First Nations children by consistently underfunding child welfare on reserves. To support the claim, Dr. Blackstock cited reports documenting the inequality and the impacts on children, including documents issued by the Auditor General of Canada and the Standing Committee of Public Accounts. On January 26, 2016, in a landmark decision, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruled that the federal government's long-standing underfunding of child and family services on First Nations reserves and the failure to ensure First Nations children can access government services on the same terms as other children, as per Jordan's principle, discriminates against 163,000 First Nations children First Nations children on the grounds of race and national and ethnic origin. Her advocacy has resulted in a wide range of services now being provided to Indigenous children, youth, and families. The battle is not yet over, but the 2016 victory represents significant progress. With all of these achievements, honors, and accolades, I believe that the phrase that might best describe Dr. Blackstock is auntie to 163,000 children. And for those who may not fully understand Indigenous kinship ties, auntie is used to honor those Indigenous women who care for our children. Dr. Blackstock, we welcome you here this evening.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be joining you from unceded Algonquin territory here in Ottawa. And my thoughts are with all of you in BC who are affected by the floods and were affected by the fires before that. It's such a great honor to be a part of this event. I have learned about Dr. Korczak's contributions and have been inspired by his example. You know, when we think about people as extraordinary as this man, they have one fundamental thing in common, is that their love is stronger than their fear. That their compulse to act is stronger than their inertia. And that their sensibility of giving is stronger than their desire to accumulate. It's really ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances who do the right thing for children when they need us the most. And there is no doubt that First Nations children need all of you the most at this particular time. So I'm just gonna share my slides if I can. Get to that. It says that I can't, well, another participant is sharing them. I don't know if somebody in technology can fix that up for me. Perfect. This is the new world of Zoom. And, you know, we've heard a lot about Canadian history in this last 6 months since the survivors' truce from Kamloops were affirmed and the rediscovery of the 215 sacred little souls in Kamloops. And after that, the children in Cowessess and in many other First Nations communities. It was as if the Canadian soul was awakened with a red hot poker stick, that all of a sudden the truce had mounted up and Canadians could not look away. But what do we really learn from history, and how does that affect the way that we see things today? You know, these headlines from the New York Times and CTV News came in the same week. One was looking at the 715 unmarked graves in Cowessess First Nation. The other was that the federal government was taking this generation of First Nations children to court to deny them equitable access to services and to deny the children that were hurt the compensation that they deserve and were awarded by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. We have a reflex in our consciousness, and that is almost to look at the past and moan and apologize in a way that kind of erases the contemporary injustices. Because if we don't think about all these injustices as things that have already gone on, then we loosen the strings of our own accountability to the children today. We're able to continue to walk down the street while we know that First Nations children in many communities across this country have no water. We're able to go and look at government budgets and see priorities such as, you know, sporting events and all these other things when First Nations children are receiving lesser services than other children are in this country. All of this allows us, this kind of casting back into history, all of the injustice, releases us from the obligation to do something today. But the opportunity and the gift of all those children in those unmarked graves is to compel us to not only look at what we see in plain sight as the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, the federal government's ongoing inequitable funding of federally funded public services for First Nations, and the land and resource disputes. It asks us to look at them, but to do one thing we have not done before, and that is not look away. Because when we take a clear-sighted look at Canada's history, we have to deal with a bunch of truths. One is that the harms were always in plain sight. You know, there's a historian in Australia who was doing a book about kind of why didn't the public know in Australia what was happening with the stolen generations. So he hired a bunch of students, as John Malloy says, the historian, we'll talk about in a minute. And they found out very quickly that the Australian public did know. People in the government did know. People in the churches definitely knew. It wasn't a question of us not knowing. It was a question of us having dehumanized these children to such a point that the harms that were inflicted upon them did not capture our moral imagination and compel us to act. The other myth is that people back then didn't know any better. You know what? If they had different morals, we can't judge them by the morality of today. But as I'm going to show you in the historical record, people of the period did know back then. And they thought that Canada's behavior was not only immoral, it was quite possible illegal. And the other piece that we have to do is that we haven't really learned from history. We're really good at apologizing for it, but not learning from it. We often have recitals of different types of facts in history class, but no one really kind of taking the time to really learn the lessons of history. That's starting to change now, thanks to teachers in British Columbia and other regions. For example, I was with a group of 5-year-olds in Victoria just a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about the statue of John A. Macdonald being removed from City Hall. A little 5-year-old girl who had learned about residential schools and other things in her family and in her daycare center and school asked probably the most important question, which wasn't why was the statue taken down? Her question was, why was the statue put up there in the first place? But for many leagues of us, we just kind of accept these things as a matter of course, because we haven't received the education necessary to really learn like history like that 5-year-old has. The second is that the injustices continue right on our watch. For all of us who thought, you know, man, if I was on the side of the railroad tracks when Cheney Wenjack was walking alone in the cold, running away from residential school, I would have been there to do something. Or if you think about all those children in the unmarked graves, that you would have been there to say, I love you, and we're going to stop the hurt. Your moment is actually right now. That opportunity isn't behind you, it's in front of you. And then getting to this turning the page of history. We get so uncomfortable when we talk about Canada's history. We kind of do a bunch of things. One is the false equivalency argument, which is look at all the good stuff that Canada does. Oh yeah, their treatment of First Nations isn't that great. And that allows us to turn the page, to look away. And every time we do look away, the injustices not only continue, but in far too many cases, as we're going to see, children die and continue to die. So let's think about what colonialism is. This is a definition by Eduardo Galeano, who's a Uruguayan journalist and writer. And it talks about blatant colonialism, things like the taking of lands and resources. That's a bit more concrete, and many people think about colonialism in that way. But invisible colonialism is equally as important, and perhaps even in some ways more potent, because it infiltrates not only the soul of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples who are subject to this type of sustained oppression, it also infiltrates the soul of other people in the country who are trained to believe that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples are savage and everything else is civilized. And it happens in nuanced ways. Think about it in academia, for example, where there's such a preference for new or coming around the corner information. If you wrote a paper today and you didn't have a 2021 cite, then you'd probably be marked down for that. But when we look at Indigenous cultures, where that type of knowledge has been handed down for thousands of years, that gets discounted because it just seems to be so old. So there's lots of ways this plays out. And it's also with the erasing of history. So when we think about colonialism, we think about dispossession of land, dispossession of resources, dispossession of language, dispossession of culture, and of course, dispossession of children. So it was all of these things together that creates this package of toxic colonialism that continues to pile up on the hopes and dreams of children. Now, I talked a little bit at the front end about the inequalities in federally funded public services. What a lot of people still don't understand is that the federal government funds public services for First Nations on reserves. And since Confederation has done so at far lesser levels. So when you look at their television screen and you see things like First Nations not having access to clean drinking water, you may think that is an aberration, that all the other public services must be equitably funded. But unfortunately, you'd be wrong. These inequalities are cross-cutting. And the federal government has persisted in these inequalities despite knowing about them, despite knowing about the harms of children, and despite having solutions to remedy it. That has been a consistent pattern in Canada's history. Now, what's the problem with underfunding? Well, it's pretty obvious to most of us. We can just imagine if our own public services were cut from 30 to 50%, or 1 in 6 of us was on a boil water advisory. But the research is also really compelling, and I think it's something we're thinking about. Reducing the inequalities in your own society is really one of the closest things to a silver bullet that we have in social sciences and economics, and in health. If we were to reduce the inequalities that First Nations people face compared to others, and do so in culturally appropriate ways, we'd be looking at reductions of children in care, we'd be looking at reductions of persons who are incarcerated, reductions in mental health, and increase of the good things, like increase in positive cultural identity, increases in terms of educational outcomes, better economic growth. All of these things are tied to it. The reverse is also true. The greater we keep these inequalities and we perpetuate them, we're going to perpetuate those hardships. Even economically, this makes no sense whatsoever that the government continues to do this. Because if you invest in $1 in a young child, you can save up to $18 downstream. The reverse is also true. Cheap out on that dollar, and you're going to pay the $18 downstream in public money, as people without the same opportunities tend to have more access on social services. So this is a report that we did with Sir Michael Marmot, one of the worldwide experts on health equity and inequity, and it spells all this out. But one of the interesting things that we did here is we heard from persons from Afro descent and Indigenous peoples that the determinants of health, as they're widely known, are not culturally neutral, nor do they account for some of the significant differences that are shaped by the colonial experience and structural discrimination. And nor do they take account of the Indigenous worldview. One that's really top of all of our minds as we think about the people affected by the floods in BC today is the whole concept of climate change. Now, climate change really is a Western concept. It's looking at the climate to the degree that it's a threat to humanity. That's one way of thinking about it. And those threats are real. But for Indigenous people, we're of the land. It's a place of memory. It's a place of spirit. It's a place of sustenance. We're part of it. So that's a very different conception of the relationship of the land versus climate change, where it's looked at almost as a threat and as a purveyor of resources. So you can check out this report. It's in Spanish, it's in English, and it's in French. So these inequalities I was saying to you really date back to Confederation. But here's one of the people who knew better. This guy is Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, born in Mount Pleasant, Ontario, just south of Toronto, and he receives his medical degree when Canada was 9 years old. He became Chief Medical Health Officer here in Ontario. He wrote Ontario's first health code, which was widely modeled in the other provinces. And due to his appointment as president of the American Public Health Association, his health code was also replicated in many of the United States. He became his aspiration was to become the Chief Medical Health Officer of Canada. So he knew he needed to step out of the provincial regime and into the federal scene. And the stepping stone there was to take a position as the Chief Medical Health Officer for the Department of Interior and Indian Affairs in 1904. One of the very first jobs that he was sent out to do was to survey the health of the kids in residential schools. And what he found was absolutely appalling. The children were dying at a rate of 25% per year. If you followed them over 3 years, close to 50% of them were dead. And in one school for which thorough statistics on the deaths of children were kept, for every 3 children that walked in, only 1 would walk out alive. Now, Dr. Bryce looked at what was the cause of this. And on his face, it was tuberculosis. Many people might say, well, tuberculosis was killing other kids too, and you would be right, but not at these rates. So what was driving the higher rates in the schools? Well, it would be things that are very familiar to us, thanks to all of our public health officers who have been educating us about COVID-19. Canada was put in, the churches were putting sick kids in with healthy kids. The buildings were poorly ventilated. The children were malnourished, therefore more susceptible to disease, and there was a dramatic overcrowding. All the things that are familiar to us in COVID, those were the same kind of conditions that created what the Evening Citizen newspaper would call a veritable hotbed of disease. What made matters worse is that the First Nations kids, Métis and Inuit kids going to these schools were receiving far less healthcare. I mean, far less healthcare than all other kids, other people in Canada, dramatically less so. So Dr. Bryce, being a man of science, being a bureaucrat, he was absolutely convinced the Laurier administration would take these findings seriously. He presented his reports and he asked the government to take immediate measures to save the kids' lives. What did the government do? It would be wrong to say the government failed to take action, because they didn't fail to take action. They chose not to take action. They acknowledged that Dr. Bryce was correct, that these children were dying at those rates, and certainly that underfunding problem had been brought to their attention before. But they did not want to pay the $10,000 to $15,000 it would have cost to help the kids and save their lives back then. You may be thinking, well, $10,000 to $15,000, that was a lot of money. Maybe they couldn't afford it. Well, $10,000 to $15,000 was a lot of money, but they definitely could afford it. Canada's budget was well over $100 million then. So this was really a conceivable drop in the bucket. So Dr. Bryce, as we're going to find out in a minute, his report gets leaked to the newspapers. It's covered from coast to coast, and it's featured in magazines. The headlines weren't little buried in the back pages of newspapers. They were frequently on the front page. Now, the Canadian government was not happy about that at all. So they took immediate action and they cut Dr. Bryce's funding for his healthcare pursuits, particularly the keeping of statistics of the children who died in the schools. And just think of how welcome those statistics would be today in terms of identifying the number of kids who are died. But Canada cut that funding because they didn't want anyone knowing how many kids were dying. They also kept on trying to disparage him. They cut his research funding in general on tuberculosis, and they eventually push him out of the public service. But he would not be silent. And even in 1922, he takes another stab at grabbing the public's attention. You see, he's convinced that if the public actually knew about what was happening, the public would, like him, be outraged and push the government to help. And he was right in some instances, like the public was outraged, but only for a few days. And then the news media would turn to another story. The story would die, and sadly, so would the children. Now, Canada did another important thing around this invisible colonialism. They erased him from history. They made sure he was never mentioned in any history books. So he dies in obscurity, and he's buried in Canada's National Cemetery in 1932. Now, this is one of the headlines of his report. And you can see here, this is 1907. This is the Evening Citizen, which is now the Ottawa Citizen where I live. And you can see that the editors aren't playing soft with their reporting. Schools aid white plague, startling death rolls revealed among Indians. Absolute inattention to the bare necessities of health. And the people reading it were appalled. So one of the guys was Samuel Hume Blake, a lawyer, later a judge, and he says that in the Canada fails to obviate the preventable causes of death, it brings itself into unpleasant nearness with the charge of manslaughter. So it's clear that as of 1907, people thought that Canada's treatment of the children in the schools was not only immoral, it was quite possibly illegal. In the same week, Saturday Night Magazine carried a headline saying kids are dying like flies. Not unlike today where we see some of these headlines. But the reflex was very similar. And that was, this is horrible. We're outraged, but not enough to keep watching and not enough to hold the government to account. This is a guy who said no, Duncan Campbell Scott. He said no to Dr. Bryce, but he was not alone. When Duncan Campbell Scott refused to act on Dr. Bryce's calls to action, Dr. Bryce actually writes directly to Prime Minister Laurier, and Prime Minister Laurier took no action to save the children's lives. But I want to tell a little bit of the story of Duncan Campbell Scott for a reason. He's known to many of you as a Confederate poet, but he also had a role in overseeing residential schools. He was on the senior bureaucrat for about 52 years. And one of the things that people often say about this period, and I heard it in the reporting around Kamloops, is, you know what? The schools weren't really badly intended. I mean, people had good intentions. They may not be the intentions we had today, but they had good intentions. No one intended for these kids to die. This comes up a lot in the dialogue about whether this was genocide or not. Well, there's a very important letter that Duncan Campbell Scott writes in 1910 to the Indian Affairs official actually in British Columbia. And in this letter, he rightfully says that it is very well known that the children are dying in the schools at far higher rates than in their villages. That's the first thing you need to know. So he knows that them being in the school, they're going to die more frequently. And then he goes on. He said, but this alone does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards the final solution of the Indian problem. The final solution of the Indian problem was freeing up the lands and resources for settlement. And that was a goal that Duncan Campbell Scott was prepared to see a lot of children die for. The other important thing is, unlike Bryce, who is basically erased from Canadian history, Scott, for his loyalty to the federal service and his poetic prowess, is rewarded. He receives honorary doctorate degrees. He received the Lawrence Pierce Medal in Literature. And in 1922, the very year when the National Crime is circulating in Ottawa, published by Dr. Bryce, he is serving as the president of the Royal Society of Canada. If you go to the annual report of the Royal Society of Canada, there is no mention of the controversy of this man. This man, who is morally a coward, really was rewarded in his life. Whereas the morally courageous one, the one that I think Dr. Korczak would have good affiliation with, Dr. Bryce, he was punished and erased. We have to get much better at promoting moral courage in our organizations and supporting those who do. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is this continued whitewashing of history. In the weeks after Kamloops, if you would have gone on to Parks Canada website, maybe you were a Canadian who wanted to learn more about residential schools. Maybe you've heard something about Duncan Campbell Scott, but didn't know a lot. You would have found that Parks Canada lists him as a person of national significance. Now, I don't dispute that. He definitely is a person of national significance. What I take issue with is why he's listed. He's listed in that category as being an advocate in education. That's why Duncan Campbell Scott's on the person of national significance. If you go over to the Canadian Museum of History, they actually have light shows where they project onto the feast houses. See, they've got all the feast houses from BC along with the totem pole. Some of you have been there. And in order to raise revenue, they often have galas there. And what they do is they project images onto the feast houses. And in some cases around Halloween, they actually make the feast houses into haunted houses. This is in 2021, this kind of stuff is going on. Just as Canadians are trying to grapple for their history, and they're going to places like the Museum of History or Parks Canada to try and get at the truth. But you can see this propaganda campaign continues on. A quick word about the importance of everyone reading this book, A National Crime. It's written by historian John Malloy. And it draws out how many times the government of Canada knew what was happening in these schools and turned away as soon as the public attention dropped off. And this is a letter from a little boy named Edward B. in the Christmas season of 1923. So this is just a year after P.H. Bryce. And you can see there that he's talking about how hungry they are and how poorly treated these poor kids are in the school. We don't know if it ever made it to his parents, but it did make it into the hands of Duncan Campbell Scott. And Duncan Campbell Scott's reaction was literally 99% of the kids are too fat anyway, and he threw away the letter. That type of story echoes, it reverberates through the entire history of residential schools. Knowing what was happening, having solutions to fix it, and the Canadian government choosing not to do it. And the Canadian public knowing about it, but just having a brief attention spurt, looking away, and then the injustices continue. This is a regular pattern of Canadian history. And that's really what led us to file this Canadian Human Rights Tribunal complaint. Those inequalities that Dr. Bryce had pointed out were never fully remedied. The government might look at, maybe we'll throw a few dollars at education one year, maybe we'll release a few boil water advisories the next year, but they've never had like a Marshall Plan to eliminate all the inequalities. Racial discrimination against First Nations children has been fiscal policy by this government, by every government in Canada. And we had proof that the Canadian government's underfunding of children's services was driving more First Nations kids into foster care than at the height of residential schools. It was also creating harms and indeed contributing to the deaths of children. What we had done is we'd worked on two reports, one in 2000 and one in 2005, that documented those problems and presented economically costed out solutions. Had Canada acted on that, we would have not had the need to file this case. But we filed it because it was absolutely necessary, because Canada was not voluntarily taking that action. Again, it will produce these reports with the hopes that they would go away. Now, we filed it in 2007, 100 years exactly from when Dr. Bryce's 1907 report came out, incidentally. And Canada fought it tooth and nail on jurisdictional grounds, but they lost. And in 2016, we received this decision. A couple of things I would just want to point out here is that the tribunal itself saw the consistency in Canada's reaction to the harms of children in residential schools and the harms that were happening in that time in 2016. They were also saying that Canada is consistently making a choice to allow the harms to continue. They would later in future orders call that willful and reckless discrimination of a worst case scenario. And they also, because it's one of the things about this historical stuff is people say, well, there must be another side of the story. Particularly around this tribunal case. Well, yeah, Canada has lost 30 different legal orders, but there's got to be another side of the story. The government must have something. Well, the tribunal looked at Canada's evidence in great detail over the 72 days of hearings, and you can see there that a close viewing finds it unreasonable, unconvincing, and unsupported by the preponderance of evidence. And what is happening to the kids? Well, as the headlines are blazing and as we're getting the legal orders, we're starting to see this kind of representation fueled by the inequalities in housing, in poverty rates that are higher, domestic violence, trauma related to residential schools, and addictions. And you can see now that First Nations kids are 17.2 times more likely to be in foster care than other kids. Now, notice I'm using the word First Nations and not Indigenous, because the rates for Métis and Inuit children are different. And it's very, very important that we not overuse this word Indigenous and mask these differences. The key thing for driver are those things I talked about. It's poverty, poor housing, substance misuse that gets characterized as neglect, because what the child welfare system does is codifies this structural discrimination as a parental responsibility. And I'm all about holding parents' feet to the fire for things they can change. But clearly, if you're getting less, your family's getting less because of who you are, that's not something you can easily change. and especially when you're trying to recover from the trauma inflicted by the government itself. Now, when we think about the children in residential schools and the courage of the survivors in telling their truths, that truth telling amounted in the TRC's calls to action. The top calls to action are number 1, child welfare, and number 3, Jordan's principle to end the inequalities in other public services. Put very simply, the survivors didn't want to see the injustices happen for their grandchildren. You'll remember those calls to action were released in 2015. The Prime Minister came out and adopted all of them. The tribunal rules just months after that, which should have been an opportunity for them to really act on these inequalities and solve the problem. But they didn't do it. We're now up to 21 tribunal orders, most of them non-compliance orders, and we're also in federal court. So we're having to literally drag the government towards equitable treatment of kids. Jordan's principle is an important substantive equality principle, which is ending Canada's discrimination in a significant way, but not a sufficient way. So if you have a Jordan's principle case, you know a First Nations kid, jot down this number. You need a professional note, health, education, social sciences, and a consent of a guardian. But the problem is that the majority of Jordan's principle cases are just plugging holes in those service gaps. And whereas, so children have to apply for help under Jordan's principle, but if you're non-Indigenous, you get it as a matter of course. So that's something we still have to fix. Here's some example of some of the things Jordan's principle funds. To give you a sense of how big the gaps were, the Canadian government until about 2017 literally had caps on things like feeding tubes. How many feeding tubes you would be given to feed your kid. And if you went over that amount, you had to make the choice of whether you'd rewash them to risk infection or whether you wouldn't feed your kid. In order to get mobility equipment, if your child had 3 items, maybe a stroller, a lift, and a wheelchair, the Canadian government would only allow one of those items every 5 years. So it'd take you 15 years to get those pieces of equipment. And you can imagine, given the changes in children and their development, what poor shape that first piece of equipment would be when the time you got the year 15. So Jordan's principle has been a huge win for the kids in the litigation. There's been over 1 million services and products provided by Canada under these court orders. And we're finally getting services to families to help keep families together versus going into foster care. For agencies, First Nations agencies in BC, this is the first increase in prevention in 28 years. The good news is the children are winning the litigation and the public is far more aware. But the public has still got this tendency to kind of look away. And that's where we have to keep our focus. We have to make sure that the federal government implements what's called the Spirit Bear Plan, which amounts to a Marshall Plan to end all the inequalities. Get the public parliamentary budget officer in there, cost out water, inequalities in healthcare, inequalities in education, and let's come up with a holistic plan to address all of them. There should be no place in this country for a child to be told you get less, or you're going to have to wait a lot longer for a public service simply because of your race. But we really are continuing to run an apartheid service regime in Canada. Here's where you can learn more about the legal case and of course about Jordan's principle. 2 films by the amazingly talented Elenisa Bomsawin available on the National Film Board. We Can't Make the Same Mistake Twice takes you inside to the courtroom with the trial with me. You can actually listen to the government's witnesses, make up your own minds about what you hear, think about the residential school history and whether you feel that there's a different tone in the testimony of those public servants. You'll also hear from John Malloy, the author of A National Crime, the book I'm hoping you'll all read, talk about this history and then the lived experience of the great Chief Robert Joseph. Jordan River Anderson tells the story of Jordan's principle, a little boy who languished in a hospital because he was First Nations. The government of Manitoba and Canada couldn't figure out who should pay for his services. So they left him there and he dies in a hospital, but he gives birth to Jordan's principle, which is helping so many children today. You can also watch our animation for those of you with low attention spans like me in 23 minutes. And you can watch how children of all diversities are really becoming together, like that 5-year-old little girl who asked the question, why is the statue still put up in the first place versus why it's taken down? Children across the country are starting to learn about residential schools, and we need to trust them with the truth. It's often the adults who are nervous about teaching kids about this stuff, but kids really do want to know the truth. And if you teach them about this in developmentally appropriate ways, they're going to be much better prepared to deal with reconciliation and less apt to turn the page of history when they see an injustice and just look the other way, because they'll have the context and they'll have the sense of humanity of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples deeply embedded within their hearts in a way that makes it untenable to tolerate that kind of injustice. It's going to end with a long arc of history. We've all heard that it bends towards justice. Well, in the case of Dr. Bryce, that's true. He was forgotten in history, really came alive again during the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in John Malloy's chapter on residential schools. And I went to see him when we filed that human rights complaint. I told him about the case that we had filed 100 years after his report, and I promised I'd be back when the kids won. I had no idea that that would be 9 years out. And in the meantime, I noticed that his grave was pretty overgrown. And I felt that it is a small way of gesture that we would make a little garden around it. So as we were expanding Dr. Bryce's plot, we looked over and saw a series of historical plaques being erected. And we were able to work with Dr. Bryce's descendants, including Andy Bryce from Kemison College. And we were able to erect a historical plaque and have the historical information ingrained in a curriculum that children in British Columbia and other provinces are now learning about this great man. He has gone from the most obscure grave in Beechwood Cemetery to one of the most visited, and particularly by children and young people. And he and others like him leave us with a challenge. And that is, how do we break through our own impacts of invisible colonialism to stop normalizing the discrimination that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples experience? How do we continue to speak out to the government and compel them to take the action on the solutions that are already on the books to solve many of these injustices? How are we going to hold ourselves accountable? We're the people of this period. Even if you are still embedded in the myth that people back then didn't know any better, we certainly do. So what's our excuse for sitting in the bleachers and not doing what we need to end this absolutely absurd injustice happening on our watch? And we need to learn from the past. We need to understand the history of the country. We need to understand that in history, we need to situate people of that period with other people of that period to truly understand what the moral standards were back then. And we need to avoid the temptation of giving histories equal weight. Duncan Campbell Scott, for example, was a poet. But I don't think there would be nary a ripple of his impact on history if that was the only thing he did. His contributions in poetry are far eclipsed by his role in residential schools. So we got to take action. And that's where you're going to find 7 free ways to make a difference on our Caring Society website. I'd ask all of you to get a hold of your prime minister, your premier, your members of parliament, and say, now is the time for justice for First Nations kids. And tell them that you're not going to look away, not this time, because First Nations kids matter to you. Justice matters to you. And that this is the moral duty that we owe to those kids in the ground, is to make sure that this generation of First Nations kids never have to recover from their childhoods, and non-Indigenous kids don't have to say their story. Thank you very much.
Okay, there. Sorry. I was trying to get my video going. Wow. Thank you very much, Dr. Blackstock, for this presentation. And on behalf of the UBC Faculty of Education and all our audience members, I extend a sincere gratitude to Dr. Blackstock for for what she has shared with us this evening. Your dedication and passion are an inspiration to all of us to join with you in working towards equitable access to government resources and supports for all Indigenous children. I really appreciated how you countered or certainly deconstructed the myths associated with Canada's colonial history and child welfare, how these myths were constructed and how they persist into our present. And I was quite struck by your call that we need to promote moral courage in our work to address systemic discrimination that impacts on Indigenous children through mechanisms that you shared here, the Spirit Bearer Plan, the teaching children in appropriate ways about the significance of or the significant Indigenous settler colonial history, and certainly demanding justice for First Nations kids. So, miigwech. Our evening is not over though, folks. We will now switch focus a little bit to the presentation of several awards and honors. Before we begin that work, we will learn a bit more about the life and legacy of Janusz Korczak. Lillian Borax-Nemets is a board member of the Janusz Korczak Association of Canada, and she is a UBC alumni and has taught at UBC's Writing Center for many years. She is also a published author and poet. Lillian, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I don't think I got my video. Oh. Well, the stubborn video. It says that I cannot start my video because the host has stopped it. So I don't know. Is this okay?
We can see you just fine,
Yes.
Lillian.
Okay, fine. Good. Thank you. Good evening, Your Honor, distinguished guests. On behalf of the Korczak Association of Canada, the Janusz Korczak Association of Canada, I would like to offer a few words about Dr. Janusz Korczak, aka Henrik Goldschmidt. And speaking of words, especially where children are concerned, words matter. Janusz Korczak's words are as relevant today as they were in the 1930s, when he wrote in his book, How to Love a Child, and I quote, "What a tragedy is our contemporary life, and how shameful of this generation to be passing on to its children a chaotic world. This type of world is frightening, and it is a world we cannot allow. So it should be forbidden to leave a messy world such as this to our children." Furthermore, Korczak writes, "To repair this world, one should first of all begin by repairing the well-being of its children." I do not have to tell you about the world today, as you all very well know the demons we are struggling with. There is much talk about how adults cope with the problems of living with the coronavirus. Yet I cannot help wondering how the children are coping with this world today. Here in our Canada, we are protecting them the best we can. They wear masks to school. Certain age groups are being vaccinated. But the constant sense of danger of COVID lurking in corners waiting to attack the weaker, the sicker, the marginalized, and the underprivileged is frightening. Not that those who are more privileged are not suffering as well. Korczak did not differentiate and treated each child as an equal, on an equal basis, deserving of their rights to live, to be cared for, respected, and to be loved. But what of the children's emotional struggles, their fears and disappointments, feelings of isolation, and what of their future brought about by the changing climate? An old friend said to me the other day, "We are at war again." Only this time, we seem to be at war with nature. It's the children, Korczak wrote, who always have to carry the burden of history's atrocities. I often wonder, what would Dr. Korczak do in this situation today? Maybe if he were the caregiver, would he first find out what upset them? Let them talk about it. Would he then try to lift up their spirits with stories, games, lessons? Would he try to calm and comfort them? Would he help them to understand so they could better cope? I, like Korczak, was once incarcerated in the Warsaw Ghetto. I know war, isolation, fear, and hiding from the enemy. Today, we have a different situation, but still the problem of survival. Then we were all quarantined for a plague called typhus, also a killer for which unfortunately there was no medication. Only you knew to avoid lice who were known to have spread it. I heard much about Korczak as a little girl in the ghetto, because my father was his friend, and he would often try to bring food to the orphanage if he could. In some ways, I was lucky. My Korczak was my father, who practiced the ideology of Korczak on me. He always explained in terms I could understand what caused the fear, what I must do to cope, and why. My father treated me not as a child who everyone thinks does not understand, but as an equal human being who has the right to know and to understand. He talked, I talked, and he listened. Like Korczak, my father knew the workings of a child, his needs, his foibles, his sadnesses and joys. Korczak's Warsaw Ghetto Diary and other writings inform us how he, through self-examination and experience, became a man of deep concern and compassion for a child's welfare. He took into consideration a child's healing, not only of the body, but also of the soul. He went beyond his specialization as a pediatrician and reached out to other areas of a child's human need. He listened to the child with all his senses. He was the kind of listener who really heard the child and gave them the opportunity to speak out. He taught without appearing to be teaching, the best kind of teacher who involves the student and interacts with them. Thus, he was more than a doctor, more than a teacher, but also an educator who enriched a child's emotional and intellectual development in reaction to their environment, culture, and religion. He was a mother and a father to his orphans, caring and loving them, a psychologist who intuited and was interested in the workings of a child's mind, his thoughts and feelings. He was a social reformer and a breadwinner at the same time, a great author whose many books were dedicated to children and about children. Korczak was a philosopher who has set his theories to practice and which are now taking root in this country and globally. I recently heard a lecture given by a woman who authored a recent book which I felt was written in the spirit of Korczak, who often criticized the way some parents were bringing up their children in their own image. The book is titled On Becoming a Soulful Parent by Dasi Berkowitz. It's a worthwhile read. At the end of her talk, when asked what is her final message, the author replied, "Love your children more." In conclusion, I would like to read a poem written by Richard Mirabel, a Polish poet who lived in Korczak's time. Knew him, and I believe helped him with the publication of the Little Review, a magazine for children by children. And this poem is from In Memoriam. He is not gone. Believe me, in memoriam to Janusz Korczak. He's not gone, believe me. I have seen him outside those gates, guiding his brood to an open marketplace, full of ripe fruits and the smell of flowers. I have found him in the smile of one who, beaten down, was lifted up by the friendly hands of a nameless passerby. I have seen him in his orphan's home, in deep thoughts, lost, confused, alone. And you may find him in the forgotten love of your fellow man, that every man. Warsaw, 1967. Thank you.
Miigwech, thank you, Lillian, for your story and for the teachings on Dr. Korczak and his legacy. Today, more than ever, we need to look to leaders, past and present, from around the globe for inspiration and solidarity in advancing children's rights and combating institutional and systemic racism. Next, I would like to call upon Dr. Anton Grunfeld, board member of the Janusz Korczak Association of Canada, to present the Janusz Korczak Association of Canada Scholarship in Children's Rights and Indigenous Education. Dr. Grunfeld, if you please.
Thank you, Dean Hare. So on behalf of the Janusz Korczak Association of Canada, I'm honored to present our association's graduate scholarship in children's rights and Indigenous education for the academic year 2020-2021 to Ms. Asma Afrin in recognition of her contribution towards improving and enhancing the well-being of children in the spirit of Dr. Janusz Korczak. Ms. Afrin is a PhD candidate in the Department of Language and Literacy Education at UBC. Her research addresses identity, multilingualism, and multimodality with a focus on Bangla heritage language. She's a global storybook team member and helped develop the Storybook Bangladesh, a free online literacy resource for learners of Bangla. Ms. Afrin, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. I would like to greet you all in my mother tongue, Bangla. Asha kori shobai bhalo achen. I hope you all are doing well. And I'm really sorry if you hear any sort of construction noise outside. So I'm absolutely thrilled and honored to be here today among you all who have been long-time advocates for children's rights and Canadian Indigenous education. I'm also delighted as I'm connecting with you all from my home country, Bangladesh, from my own room where I grew up. I came here a week ago and saw my father after 3 years. And last time when I came home, when I came to this room, I lost my beloved mom. And then I started my PhD. So the work that I have been doing for children's rights and community development is extremely important for me because it honors the legacy of my parents' community work, something that I have learned from them. I advocate for children's rights and multilingual literacies and identities through my community work in Bangladesh and Canada. I volunteer at the community-based Vancouver Bangla School and train and support the teachers to teach Bangla heritage language online in the COVID era. My doctoral research with Dr. Bonnie Norton investigates how teachers and children of the community-based Vancouver Bangla School collaborate to promote children's Bangla heritage language learning and develop their multilingual identities. And I believe such research is significant to ensure children's rights to maintain their linguistic and cultural connections to their forebears. So the award that I have received today has strengthened my passion about promoting multilingual literacies and identities of children around the world. And I'm immensely grateful to the Janusz Korczak Association for its generosity that has impacted many students like me over the years and supported us to honor the legacy of Janusz Korczak's life and work. So thank you very much.
Miigwech, thank you, Dr. Grunfeld, and many congratulations to you, Asma. I'm glad you could be at home to receive this award and share this with family and community. The scholarship is certainly well-deserved recognition of your academic work. As a literacy scholar myself, I plan to follow your career with interest in the coming years, and please do stay in touch with our Faculty of Education. Now, next on our program is the presentation of the Janusz Korczak Association of Canada statuette to someone that almost all of us here likely know. To undertake this work, I invite the Honorable Janet Austin, Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia, and Mr. Jerry Nussbaum, President of the Janusz Korczak Association of Canada, to take the microphone.
Hello there. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Good evening.
Right. Okay. I didn't realize I was to present this. So you've caught me a bit by surprise. But I will just say what an absolute pleasure and an honor it is to be part of this celebration today and to honor the extraordinary work that we are here to learn about this evening, to congratulate Mr. Bly-Frank, for Dr. Bly-Frank, I'm so sorry, for your outstanding contributions in so many ways. And this is really a splendid way to acknowledge that contribution over many years, and so very well deserved.
Miigwech, Your Honor. Mr. Nussbaum.
Yes, good evening, Your Honor, distinguished guest. It's my great honor and privilege to present this award. Dr. Bly-Frank is awarded the 2021 Janusz Korczak Statuette for Lifetime Achievement in Child Advocacy and Education for his vision and leadership in promoting the holistic approach to the well-being of children and young people in the spirit of Dr. Korczak. Dr. Frank.
Her Honor, the Honorable Janet Austin, lovely to see you again. Madam Justice Ardith, welcome. Dr. Charlesworth, Dean Hare, Mr. Nussbaum, and members of the Janusz Korczak Association, Dr. Blackstock, distinguished guests, and members of the virtual audience, good evening, everyone. So first, I'd like to recognize that it's my privilege to be attending this evening's event from Nova Scotia as an occupier of the beautiful lands and waters of the Mi'kmaq peoples. Allow me to begin by offering my sincere congratulations to Asma Afreen on receiving the Janusz Korczak Scholarship. And let me say how honored I am to receive the Janusz Korczak Statuette. Over my years as Dean of the Faculty of Education at UBC, it has been my privilege and with great respect to work with Jerry and members of the Korczak Association as they promote the work of improving the lives of children in the spirit of Dr. Korczak. Dr. Korczak, through his dedication and commitment knew the critical importance of focusing on and caring for the well-being of children, particularly if we want a population of healthy adults. With more than 1.2 million children in Canada presently living in food insecure households, hopefully we're all committed to the children in our own lives and to those children around the globe so that they might live safely, obtain literacy, and live with good health, free of fear, free of abuse, and in an absence of poverty and illness. So I'm truly grateful to receive this recognition this evening for my work as a teacher and as an educator. But a recognition such as this is only possible due to the support of so many people over the last 5 decades of my work. So I want to sincerely thank all those folks. So in closing, I want to thank with much appreciation the Korczak Association and her honor for the presentation of the statuette. I shall cherish its presence in our home here on the Atlantic coast. Thank you and good evening.
Well, thank you, Your Honor, and thank you, Jerry. I would like to take this moment to recognize the legacy of Dr. Bly Frank, who served as Dean of the UBC Faculty of Education for 10 years. Under his leadership, the Faculty of Education's ranking rose to 10th in the world. He oversaw the establishment of numerous endowed chairs and professorships, including 6 Canada Research Chairs and 1 CHR chair, accompanied by large gains in research funding awarded to the faculty. Bly was not all about the big flashy awards and rankings, however. From the first moment, he spoke about and acted upon his commitment to equity, prioritizing new hires and senior leadership appointments from equity-deserving groups. I'm particularly grateful for Bly's championing of the area of Indigenous education, with the result that we now have 2 Canada Research Chairs, of which I'm pleased to hold one of those, 9 Indigenous faculty members, numerous Indigenous graduate students and teacher education students. So we're starting to see certainly an increase in our numbers, along with thriving programs serving both of these student groups. Bly, we have much to thank you for, and I'm delighted to see the Janusz Korczak Association's recognition of your legacy. Many congratulations to you this evening. We have one more honoree this evening, the recipient of the Janusz Korczak Association of Canada Medal. And I will ask Dr. Jennifer Charlesworth, BC's representative for children and youth, and Dr. Christine Locke to take the microphone in order to make this final presentation.
Thank you very much. And good evening all. In your honor, Janet Austin, Dr. Blackstock, Dr. Hare, and guests. And I would like to raise my hands up to Asma Afrine and Dr. Frank, and all of you for participating this evening. I'm so grateful to be here with you all tonight in this virtual space to introduce the Janusz Korczak Medal recipient. And I'd like to start in a good way by acknowledging with respect and gratitude that I'm joining you from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen people, the Esquimalt and Songhees Nation. I want to take a moment to express my gratitude to Dr. Blackstock for her lifetime of extraordinary work on behalf of children and youth, and for your remarks this evening. And frankly, words can't capture the depth and breadth of your work and enduring courage, passion, brilliance, and impact. And tonight I have the privilege of introducing you to the Honorable Madam Justice Ardith Wacom Wapetko Waidelks, a member of the Inkakla Nation, who has also had an extraordinary career thus far, and most recently was the first Indigenous woman appointed to the BC Supreme Court. But first, I want to draw connections between Dr. Korczak and this year's medal recipient. I first learned of Dr. Korczak decades ago, actually, and I've been a student of his work ever since. And I'm grateful to the association for working so hard to make his work accessible and continuing to reveal his profound teachings. What struck me then was that he talked about loving and listening to children, of treating them with respect, holding them as sacred, and being capable agents in their own lives. And this resonated deeply with my young heart and values, and was an antidote to other coursework and professional narratives of the time that talked about professional boundaries and separation, of not caring too much or getting too connected. Dr. Janusz Korczak was a true trailblazer whose philosophies and ways of walking in the world helped create the foundation for the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, on which our work in helping children is built. Madam Justice Ardith Wacham is also a trailblazer. She, like Korczak, starts from a place of love and respect for children. She spent her career as a lawyer, mediator, teacher, author, artist, and creative, being a truth teller, advocating for the rights of others and helping others understand and shift their understanding and practice. She's especially attentive to the rights of people who are customarily excluded, including children. And she does this in the most creative of ways, much as Dr. Korczak did, inviting us in to understand and engage with head, heart, and soul. She sees the systems and exposes the inequities, beliefs, and patterns that keep our colonial systems so stuck and so dominant. And she inspires us to courage and action. A primary focus for her work has been to examine the systemic problems surrounding the over-representation and what we like to say is the over-involvement of the child welfare system in the lives of Indigenous children and families, and how as a society we can and must do better. When Bill C-92, now an act respecting First Nations, Inuit, Métis children, youth, and families was under review, she championed the redefinition of the best interest of the child. Article 3 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child states that in all actions concerning children, whether undertaken by public or private social welfare institutions, courts of law, administrative authorities, or legislative bodies, the best interests of the child shall be a primary consideration. Ardith argued for cultural considerations to be included in the definition and to provide clear directions to be interpreted and defined according to the values and traditions of Indigenous peoples. She reiterated the importance of involving Indigenous communities in the child welfare process, which in turn would respect the rights and voices of Indigenous children. Children have the right to be heard and express their own opinions on staying connected to their culture and heritage, and she's shown us over and over again just how vitally important that is and how possible it is. Ardith's work builds upon the idea Korczak spoke about many years ago to help create a society where children, especially Indigenous children, have their voices heard and their rights respected. For her dedication and contributions to law, Ardith has been appointed Queen's Counsel. She's been the recipient of many well-deserved accolades. And her continued work in championing the rights of Indigenous children and families has had a great impact on society, the judicial system, communities, and organizations, including my own office. In fact, her guidebook, Wrapping Our Ways Around the Indigenous Communities and Child Welfare, is helping to inform our work in the representative's office, ensuring that we keep Indigenous children in care at the center of our work, keeping a clear focus on maintaining the ever important connection they have to their communities, and to ensuring that as we do our work, we center those children, their rights, their voices, and wherever possible, ensure that they are not taken into care. Ardith's work and advocacy embodies the fundamental philosophies of Korczak, and through that work keeps his spirit alive. I'm grateful and honored to be introducing her today. A heartfelt congratulations to Honorable Madam Justice Ardith Wacham on this very well-deserved award. And so with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Christine Locke to present the medal and invite this year's recipient of the medal, Ardith Wacham, to speak. Thank you.
I am honored. This is the third time I have followed speakers tonight, following our representative for children and youth, Jennifer Charlesworth, following Honorable Janet Austin, and in my first time working with a representative, following Her Honor Mary Ellen Trepel-Lafon. Tonight I'm calling in from the traditional territories of the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation, the peoples of the Inlet, It's an honor to present the 6th annual Janusz Korczak Medal that's selected by the Representative for Children and Youth and in partnership with the Janusz Korczak Association. This 6th medal is awarded to has been awarded to a diverse, humble, and august group of firsts from British Columbia. And I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge Honorable Melanie Mark, who was the first in her family to graduate from high school, college, and university, and the first Indigenous woman to serve in the legislature and serve in cabinet as an Indigenous woman. Our second first was Dr. Cindy Blackstock, a first and auntie to so many, as we heard tonight, but as the executive director of the First Nations Family Caring Society. In 2018, I was honored as a co-founding member of Social Pediatrics in British Columbia with my colleagues from the School of Nursing, Dr. Judith Lynham and Lorraine Scott, and then followed that first power couple of Double Order of Canada, His Honor Ted and Hughes and his wife Helen Hughes, as they worked valiantly in British Columbia and worked to reform the child welfare system in British Columbia. Last year was our first teacher with Dr. Kimberly Schoner-Reichel, who went from being a middle school teacher to developing the Human Early Learning Partnerships first middle developmental instrument, and has taken her work now to Illinois. And now our first judge, Madame Justice Ardith Walpetko Wydelks, welcome, who honors us in the Janusz Korczak Medal for working towards improving children's rights in ways that encourage love for children, listening to children, fostering healthy children's lives, and building capacities in children in the spirit of Dr. Korczak. It is an honor to award this to our first Indigenous female justice in the Supreme Court of British Columbia. Madam Justice.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm not sure if you can hear me or not, and I want to thank Jennifer Charles. Oh, good. I want to thank Jennifer Charlesworth and Dr. Chris Locke for the beautiful introduction, and the Janusz Korczak Society for this award. I have to say that it is truly one of the deepest honors of my life. I'm terribly moved. And I'm very honored to have followed this wonderful group of speakers and to be amongst the company of others who've received this award. And I want to share this brief story. I today am joining you from Scout-Kale territory, the Scout-Kale community on Stalo territory, but my own home community is the Tlakatma Nation, and I'm from the Tlakatma. So my own territory is from the areas near Lytton and Merritt and Ashcroft and Spence's Bridge. And right now, this summer, we really suffered with the fires, and now my nation is suffering from a flood. But I wanted to share these pictures, which I think you'll see here. And these pictures are really the genesis of a project that I worked on with that nation that I think helped to define what my work and the work of the people that I've worked with within the nation in the area of child welfare has been. And in the first slide you see there, it's a slide in 2014. And in 2014, or 1914, when CN was building a railway tracks through the canyon, there was a blast that actually completely blocked the run of the Fraser River, and there were thousands of fish who were stuck. And the Tlakatma people, who knew that the fish had sustained us for generations, went to the river, and we carried them over using our hands, using baskets, using blankets. We carried them for days. And the reason that they survived is because of that. And when our elders came to me and they said, we need to do something about our kids. We have so many kids in care. They said to me, we want you to think of this story because our kids are in that same position now, that our kids are alone and sometimes they're stuck and they need our laws and they need our love and they need our ways to wrap around them. And we want you to find a way to use the law to be able to do that. And so that was the genesis of this project. And you can see there the other picture. This is my baby. I have two babies, but this is my youngest baby. And there she is wrapped around with the love of her auntie hands. There's a lot of auntie hands there. And I think that when I thought of this award and I thought of the work that we need to do for children, one of the things that I thought of Dr. Korczak and that idea of holding hands. So when we look at working with children, we not only need to help them through, help their families through, we have to be able to take their hand and walk with them, to walk behind them, to protect them, to make sure that they get through. And one of the things that I think is increasingly important is that it's not just children when they're little, there's children when they're youth, it's children when they become parents. And we need to be able to look at what the impacts of, say, being involved in the child welfare system and the traumas that come with that. And we need to be able to walk with them as they try to recover. And for the work that I've done, we've been very conscious that we need to incorporate Indigenous laws as a very powerful way of doing that. But the empowerment of children, the empowerment of the voices of children, and really honoring the fact, in the case of what I'm talking about here, that Indigenous children have a right to belong to the nations, to the people, to the culture that they come from. And I'm very honored to accept this award. As I've said, it truly is one of the greatest honors of my career. And I thank you very much. I'm very familiar with Dr. Korczak's work. Thank you.
Oh, Miigwech. Thank you, Dr. Charlesworth and Dr. Locke, as well as Mr. Nussbaum. And just as our welcome, many congratulations. I raise my hands to you in respect on receiving the Janusz Korczak Medal. Such important advocacy and contribution to Indigenous children and families and communities. I so appreciate the notion of love and laws to wrap around children and youth and to take their hands and to walk with them. So miigwech for sharing that. Such an important evening. I'm grateful for the productive partnership that the UBC Faculty of Education has enjoyed with the Janusz Korczak Association over the years, and I offer our sincere thanks to the association and members of the board. Once again, I would like to say miigwech, which is thank you to all of our distinguished guests for this evening, joining us this evening, the Honorable Janet Austin, Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia, the Honorable Stephen Lewis, was not able to join us here this evening, sorry. And of course, our Dean's Distinguished Lecturer, Dr. Cindy Blackstock. Special thank you to Jennifer Charlesworth for her assistance in presenting the medal tonight. Chi miigwech, I want to end the evening with a chi miigwech, which is a big thank you to all of our audience members. I hope that you are as stirred and as uplifted as I am. I appreciate you for joining. I appreciate you joining us this evening, and I look forward to seeing you again at our future events. Have a wonderful evening.